Hello everyone. So in this video of our Spring Boot lessons, we are going to look into a more detail about the Spring Boot auto configuration internals. We have already discussed about the Spring Boot auto configuration, what kind of a feature it brings into your disposal, right? In this video, we are going to look into a deeper how the Spring Boot auto configuration works internally. What are the different components which makes that auto configuration intelligence system to work for you, right? So quickly, what we are going to cover in this one is, as I said, right, we are going to look into a details of how the Spring Boot auto configuration works, and then uh, some of the internals of the Spring Boot auto configurations, right? So this is going to be a combination of some theoretical part as well as some of the, we are going to look into the code base. Again, this is going to be a little longer tutorial, the video lesson, because we need to cover a couple of different things, the basics as well as some of the building blocks for the auto configurations. All right, so let's get started. Have this simple web application. You can start with any of your existing Spring Boot application if you have. Uh, by default, the debug mode for Spring Boot is set as a false because Spring really don't want to throw out so many number of different debugging statements, right? So what I'm going to do is I have set the debug statement is equal to true, and I'm going to run our application. All right. Application started. What I want you to pay a little close attention is these outputs, right? Additional output, conditional evaluation reports. So what is happening? There are three different section, three on a high level, three major different sections. One is the positive match, and then if we scroll down, there will be another saying negative match, if you see, right? And then there are two more sections which says there is any exclusion happened and unconditional classes. Okay, so our area of interest is the exclusion and the inclusion, or the positive matches and the negative matches, right? How the Spring Boot auto configuration works is it scans the class path, it looks into what are the different classes which are exist into the class path, and the how you basically making sure is through your pom.xml file, right? This is the central control system for our Spring Boot application. Based upon these configurations, there are certain number of jars or the class files that will get into our class path. So Spring Boot scans those class paths, so the class path, and based upon what are the classes present into your class path, it takes a call whether it needs to enable a certain auto configurations or not. Let's take an example of I'm not going to get into codex. Let's take example of our dispatcher servlet auto configuration. This is a web application. The one I'm showing right now to you is a web application, and you remember from our previous discussion that if you're creating a web application using a Spring Boot, you are not creating a dispatcher servlet, right? That is being automatically taken care for you by the Spring Boot. So if you see here, what happening is Spring Boot is basically looking into a specific class in our class path. Based upon that class path, it takes a call whether it needs to create a dispatcher servlet for you, along with all the required configurations, right? The default configurations. So in this positive match, it found that servlet registration class, and it basically going to enable this servlet auto configuration dispatcher for us. Okay, let's take another example. Jackson auto configuration. If you remember, Spring Boot has an default dependency, or it automatically give you the Jackson capability, right? It automatically add that Jackson into the class path, and then the auto configurations are already in place. You don't have to write even a single line of a code to use to kind of accept the data into a JSON format, and even need to set when you are sending back the data into a JSON format. You're not writing any code, right? Those are being taken care by the Spring Boot automatically. So if you look into this section, it's trying to is scanning a class path, and it's trying to find out a specific class which is an object mapper. If it happens to find, the Spring Boot happens to find this class in the class path, it is automatically going to enable the Jackson auto configuration. That means all the Jackson capabilities with the default setups, the defaults will be created for you by the Spring Boot, right? And then there are a number of different things which happen based upon what kind of application we are building, what kind of starters we are putting in place through the pom.xml file. There is a other part of it which says a negative matches. The negative matches means these are the auto configurations which are not going to be create going to be enabled by the Spring Boot, because it was not able to find that specific class into the class path, which is kind of a trigger point for these auto configuration, right? For example, ActiveMQ. R is a simple web application. I'm not using a ActiveMQ starters, right? So that means there is no class as a connection factory in our class path. So that's the reason it's saying negative match. So that means there will be no auto configuration created by the Spring Boot. The moment you add the active MQ dependency into your pom.xml file, and if Spring find this javax jms.connection factory in your class path, this auto configuration will be activated by the Spring Boot, right? So that's the beauty of the Spring Boot, how it internally matching, looking into your class path and then taking a call. What are the different auto configuration? What are the different configuration I have to create in order to start that application, right? So in the next section, what we are going to look into it, how the Spring Boot is doing it, right? There is no black magic around it. There are certain things. There is some of the feature of the Spring framework in itself, which are being used by the Spring Boot to accomplish this, right? So in the next section, we are going to look into those things. Right. So Spring introduced an annotation named as the conditional annotation, right? Let's see how it looks. This is how it looks like. Okay. So the conditional annotation, if we get into this, conditional annotation is nothing, but it's kind of a, you can use it to load certain classes, certain configurations, certain beans based if those conditions are matching, right? Spring Boot. So this annotation is a part of the core Spring framework. Okay, if you uh, I think some of you may already be aware of the profile feature of the Spring Boot. This is kind of a one step ahead of that profiling, right? There are certain restrictions into the, or the limitation into the profile annotation. Conditional annotation gives you the flexibility where you can build the different kind of conditions. What are the conditions based upon which you want to enable configurations, enable us want to create a bean and all those kind of things, right? Most So Spring Boot use this annotation. So what they have done is they have created a different number of annotations which are extension of the conditional annotations, and they use those annotations while the auto configuration is getting into the picture. So they have a certain number of annotations put into your configuration class. It reads that one. If the condition matches, it loads the bean. If condition doesn't match, it's not going to load the beans, right? We will be looking into those details. But before we jump into the internals of the Spring Boot auto configurations and as well as all those extension of the conditional annotations, let's see how the conditional annotations works. Okay, so for the simplicity of this tutorial, what I'm going to write a very simple conditions. Let's assume that our application is going to be deployed into two different countries. One is US, the second one is Canada, right? And let's assume that we are going to have a tax calculation service. So of course, if it's in the United States, right, there will be a different tax calculation logics and tax calculation, or the tax rate into the US, right? The same application is deployed onto the Canadian side of it, there will be a different the tax calculations, right? Or there will be a different tax rate. How do we want to handle that one, right? So what we are going to do is we are going to create a conditional logic around it, where based upon the user locale, we are going to either use the US tax calculation service, or we are going to use the Canadian tax calculation service. Okay, so let's quickly look into our code base. Okay, I have already written the code, but it's a very simple code actually, so you don't have to uh, it's kind of, you don't have to look into more details. Okay, so this is a text calculation. It's just returning the text rate, which is just normal number. Okay, so this is my simple Canadian text calculation service. It's saying that okay, your text calculation rate is 1.5. Your US text calculation service is saying text calculation is 2.0, right? So it's a very simple. Now I have a two conditional logic, right? What I'm saying is, so this is your conditional class, which we are going to extend to create our conditional class. So in this one, what I'm saying is there is a method which says matches. This is the method which you have to implement. So what I'm saying here is, if your default locale is equal to Canada, then return true. Or for the US one, if the default locale is US, return true. Okay, so those are my two conditions that says check the default locale of the customer, and if it's US, send the US true. If it's Canadian, send Canadian as a true. So technically you can only have a one default locale, right? That's how it's going to. There are other complications around it, but to keep it simple, we are just assuming a number of different things. Okay, now we have both the things, right? We have created two condition type conditions, right? Now let's see how we can use it. So these are our two bean definitions. If you're seeing these two definitions, nothing I'm saying, one is for the US text calculation, one is for the CA text calculation, right? And then I'm sending, if it's a US, I'm sending a new instance of the US text calculation. For Canadian, I'm sending a Canadian text calculation instance, right? The only thing is, if you see this conditional logic here, this conditional says that this bean should only be, this is bean is active only for the CA text calculation type condition. If this condition matches, then this bean will be created, and this bean will be created if for the US text. That means that if your default locale is US, this bean will be created. If your default locale is Canada, the Canadian one will be created, right? If you run this application, and for just for a simplicity, I have created a controller here. This is nothing but I'm just returning. I'm sorry, I'm not returning anything. I'm just kind of a printing out the text rate, right? So let's quickly run our application and see a couple of things here. Okay, I'm going to clear this one to give you a better picture. Here is my controller. If I hit the controller, let's see what's the output. If you see, testing the bean 2.0, and how does it come into the picture? Sorry. How does it come into the picture is, if you see our implementations, this is 1.5, and if you see this one, the return is 2.0. So right now my default locale is US. So that's the reason I'm getting 2.0, right? If you want to see how the Spring is kind of loading all the beans, you can always enable the more debugging, and then you can see what are the different beans being loaded by the Spring Boot, right? So now we have the basic understanding of the conditional annotation, how the conditional annotation works. Let's take a one step ahead and see how the Spring Boot is using these conditions, or this conditional annotation, how the Spring Boot is extending this conditional annotation to create that auto configuration magic for us. Okay, so as I said, right, there are a number of different annotations created by the Spring Boot, and those are extension of our conditional annotations. Okay, out of all those different number of annotation, I will, at the end of this video, I'm going to give you a link where you can get all those different annotations. There are two annotations which are really of a kind of a, those are most of the common annotations, conditional annotations being used by the Spring Boot. So one of them is conditional on class. Okay, this is the one. And another one is conditional on, okay, conditional on missing bean. Okay, I think I have done something. Conditional on, what I'm doing wrong. Conditional on class. Okay, these are the two main annotation that those are being used a lot by the Spring Boot auto configuration. There are another, there is a negation for this one, which says conditional on missing class. There is a condition on a bean, and there are a few others for based upon a property in other part, but those are lesser used annotations. But let's try to understand the concept behind this one, and then probably you can always relate it with the other annotations, right? So as the name suggests, right, conditional on class, this is most common conditional annotation that are being used by the Spring Boot, right? So this annotation allows you to include the configuration class based upon a specific class. So you have your configuration class, and then you need to take a call. You need to decide when should I load this configuration class, when this configuration class should come into the picture. So in order to take that call, you have that conditional on class annotation. So you will say, if Spring Boot happen to find this specific class into the class path, use this configuration, use this class configuration, right? We will take a look into it. And then the other part of it is conditional on missing class. So that means if Spring Boot is not able to find a specific this given class in the class path, use this configuration, load this configuration class, right? The conditional on missing bean is onto the bean level. It says if the Spring Boot is not able to find this specific, or not the Spring Boot, in terms of the Spring is not able to find this bean into the application context, create an instance of the bean. And the other part for this one is where you want to load the this on a conditional on bean, which says if Spring Boot happen to find this bean into the application context, load or create the instance of this bean, right? uh, for a better understanding, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open one out of the box auto configuration class, which will give us a better picture. Okay, all right. Our Jackson auto configuration class, right? This class will get into the picture. It will make sure that all the default configurations are in place for the Jackson configurator, right? How does it works? As I was talking about, right? Okay, sorry for this one. Let me to increase the font a little bit. Oh no. Okay, so this says there are two things. Your auto configuration class is always going to be a configuration class. That is the fundamental kind of that's a fundamental for the Spring Boot as well as for the Spring, right? Now let's get to the other point of it. What if you what I was talking about, the conditional on class annotation, what does it say? That if Spring Boot, when scanning the class path, it happened to find the object mapper class into the class path, create this Jackson auto configuration. So that means if the object mapper is into the class path, you have specified that you want to have the Jackson as part of your dependency, which is either through the auto configurations, either you are using a web application or some other things, right? So that means when you say that add the Spring Boot starter web, Jackson is being added automatically. So that means there will be object mapper class into the class path, right? So that means this Jackson auto configuration will automatically be created for you. Okay, so there are a number of different things happening here, right? There are some Jackson component modules, the beans are being created. So when you create this class, all the different things will get into the picture. Spring Boot is going to take care a number of different things, right? I'm also going to look into other part of which says condition on missing bean, right? Let's take another example which will give us a better picture. All right, so other part is the conditional or missing mean. So that means if the Spring Boot is not able to find any mean of the type object mapper, so this condition will become true, and the Spring Boot is automatically going to create a bean for the object mapper, right? So that's the overall thing where how the Spring Boot will get into scan the class path and all those kind of things, right? Which includes when I should load a given class, auto configuration class, what are the different conditions to load a specific bean, right? And as I said, there are a few other things. For example, there will be a, just want to show you one thing which should be based upon enable configuration property, right? If it happen to find the Jackson properties, then load this configuration, right? But the base concept is same. There are different annotations which are an extension of your conditional annotations, and then based upon either it can be onto the class level, it can be you can put the condition based upon the beans, for example a condition on missing bean, condition on a class, and then Spring Boot take a call whether it needs to create load that auto configuration or not. Okay, so till now we get an understanding how what is conditional annotations, how the Spring Boot is using the extension of the conditional annotation, right? If you open this one, this is nothing but the conditional annotation, right? So that's what we were looking at, right? So that's how the overall auto configuration magic works. But there is a one missing piece here, right? You need how the Spring Boot understand what are the different configuration classes, where I should be looking for those classes, right? You cannot keep on scanning all the different classes into your class path. That will be too much. Think about a enterprise application with hundred of different dependencies and maybe thousand of different classes. If Spring Boot start scanning each and every class, I think the startup time is going to be a lot. It keep on scanning, and every time you start your application, it's going to be too much work for the Spring or the Spring Boot, right? It would be an efficient way to tell the Spring that what are the auto configuration classes, where should they looking for the auto configuration classes. Okay, so Spring has already a way, a mechanism where it basically you tell the Spring location, and then the Spring Boot has a specific loader, class loader, we call it as a class loader, right? That class loader will basically read that property file, and then it makes sure that okay, it's basically reading that configuration files, picking up all the classes, and then it start matching those conditions, right? That it's Spring factory loader. It's based upon the Spring factory pattern, not the factory pattern. It's basically based upon a special file. So there is a spring.factory file, which the standard location for that one is inside your meta inf file, and the name of the property file is spring.factories. Spring Boot is using that mechanism. What happen is when you create your auto configurations, you have to tell Spring Boot that what is your auto configuration class, right? Because uh, either, as I said, right, you cannot keep on scanning. Spring cannot keep on scanning all the classes. So what is going to happen? You created this auto configuration class. In our case, it is a Jackson auto configuration. You have a different condition which tells Spring Boot that hey, even you know that this is the my auto configuration class, read these different conditions to take a call whether you should be creating or you should be kind of initializing this class or not. You are basically using all the configuration or not, right? So in order to do that, what is going to happen is, let's take a look at our out of the box Spring Boot auto configuration. Oh, we were there, right? That's cool. So if you see, this is this out of the box. Let me to close this one. Okay, so this is out of the box a Spring Boot auto configuration, and as I was talking about, And inside the meta inf folder, there is a spring.factories class. Okay, this is the missing piece of our Spring Boot auto configuration magic. So there are a number of different properties. This time we are going to look into the one which says auto configuration. This is the key, right? This is a standard key which says org.spring framework, blah, 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 enable auto configuration. And these are the list of your auto configuration classes. When we will be creating our own auto configuration or the starters, we will be using this concept, right? But for this one, it says these are the different out of the box auto configurations. So what is going to happen? As I said, Spring Boot, the Spring Boot will read this property file, and then there is a specific key being used by the Spring Boot. It basically scan all these auto configuration classes based upon the different conditions. It tries to find, do I have that kind of a conditions, if the conditions are matching. If yes, it's going to load that auto configuration for us. So for example, the Jackson one, if the all the conditions are matching, the Jackson jar is into the class path, the class is into the class path, the Jackson auto configuration will be kicked in by the Spring Boot. Similarly, if you have a H2 database in your class path, there is a H2 auto configuration, right? So that auto configuration, all your conditions will match there, and that means all the default auto configurations for the H2 will be kicked in by the Spring Boot. So that's an overall logic of how the Spring Boot works. Okay, let's summarize a little bit to make sure that we understand the concept of the Spring Boot, right? So in order for Spring Boot to work, as I said, the the core thing is the conditional annotations. Okay, this is the core concept, in the sense that the underlying magic based upon what are the different conditions. This is the parent annotation, right? There are a number of different uh, extension for this one, as I said, right? For example, conditional on class, my bad, then conditional on missing class, then conditional on missing bean, and all those things, right? And then the second part is you need to create a auto configuration class with these conditions, okay, which says when this auto configuration should kick in, right? And then the third part is our spring.factories, right? The typical location for this one is meta inf.spring.factory in your extension or out of the box one, right? And how does it work is there is a specific key in this property file. Come on, this is the key, and then you can have a, a comma separated list of your auto configuration classes, right? So Spring Boot, when the Spring will you start your Spring Boot application, the Spring core, the core Spring, right, that reads this spring.factory file. It will create that key values pair, and then Spring Boot kicks in. It looks for a specific property file which says auto configuration. So whatever the classes you have defined here, it picks the class, it reads the conditions you have defined in that auto configuration class based upon these different set of the annotations. If those matches, Spring Boot will create or the kicks in the auto configuration for you. I hope that this tutorial will give you at least a certain idea how the auto configuration works, right? We know that auto configuration works. We just include those 3 or 4 lines in our pom.xml file, and everything else will be taken care by the Spring Boot. But it's always a good thing to understand how those things are working behind the scene for us, right? So in the next lesson, we are going to create a custom starter for us, and that will give you an idea how these different things will club together, because we will be creating our starter, we will be adding the our starter entry into these auto configurations and all those kind of things, right? All right,